The moon had just begun to set over the small town in North Carolina. The narrow streets smelled of wet earth after the night's rain, and the street lamps cast a faint golden light. In the center of town stood the courthouse, where dozens of people had already gathered, some with curiosity, some with fear. The trial of James Carter, a local teacher accused of stealing large sums from the city library, was about to take place. The case instantly became a sensation. How could someone from among us, someone who teaches children, turn out to be a thief? Whispered neighbors, glancing at each other. James sat in the courtroom, arms crossed, appearing calm, but inside he was twisting. No one knows the truth, but society always looks for a simple answer. Perhaps, as Martin Luther King once said, justice is slow, but truth never dies. But will I live to see that truth? The prosecutor went first, his voice firm and convincing. We have evidence. James Carter was the last person to leave the library after closing. He had a motive, and we will show that this was no coincidence. People in the courtroom nodded, catching the logic as easily as counting in school. Someone muttered, "It makes sense. He's guilty." James looked at them and felt the weight of the whole town fall on him. He wanted to scream, "You don't even want to listen. I'm not here to satisfy your fears." But the words remained in his heart. The judge called a recess, and the townspeople dispersed to cafes and shops to discuss who was guilty. The simple explanation, like a virus, spread. The teacher is the thief. People always look for simple answers to complex questions, James thought, recalling Albert Einstein's words. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler than the truth. The town slowly accepted this version, because complexity always scares. Neighbors already imagined James going to prison while the library children were left without a mentor. But James had hope, a small inner light. He knew that truth does not die, even when trapped in the narrow courtroom among shouts and whispers. The town awoke the next morning with a sense that everything was already decided. Newspapers published identical headlines, James Carter's name appearing next to the word guilty, even though the trial had not yet reached a verdict. In cafes, people spoke of him as if they had known him all their lives. I always said something was off about him. Too quiet, the quiet ones always hide something. And these words traveled more easily than facts, more easily than doubts. James walked down the courthouse corridor, hearing the conversations quiet behind him, thinking that Mark Twain had been right when he said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. The defense tried to speak about lack of evidence, the absence of direct witnesses, but society didn't care. They wanted an ending, simple and clear, someone to point a finger at. And when the judge read the decision, James already saw it in people's eyes. They weren't listening to the words. They were listening to their own desire to close the case. The verdict sounded like a formality, and at that moment he remembered Abraham Lincoln's words, which he once read to students. You can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time, which once sounded like hope, and now like a distant whisper. He was let out of the courtroom, and the doors closed as quietly as society had closed eye. The case was closed. The town sighed in relief, because injustice sometimes looks a lot like justice, especially when it is convenient. Years passed, and James Carter's name slowly disappeared from conversations. The town continued living. Mayors changed, building facades were repainted, and new shelves were installed in the library. But the case remained conveniently closed. No one liked to remember that they had once ruined a person's life for the sake of comfort. James served his sentence in a federal prison, counting time not by calendars but by letters, which grew fewer and fewer. He worked in the prison library. The irony was almost painful. Handling the books, he often caught himself thinking that the system prefers silence to truth, and then the words of George Orwell would appear in his mind. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. He didn't say it aloud, but carried it inside. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in New York, a financial consultant named Richard Bell was building a career, giving interviews, donating money to education, and smiling as he recalled the small town in North Carolina, where he had once, miraculously, avoided a financial scandal. No one connected the stories, because people like to think coincidences have no benefit and truth is abstract. Only James, sitting among the worn books, felt that somewhere, there was a person for whom it had been very convenient that he was found guilty. And this thought kept him alive, for as Friedrich Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. And he waited, not knowing yet that time was slowly but inexorably moving in his favor. Time did its quiet work. It erased the sharp edges of memories in the town, but did not destroy the truth itself. James walked out into freedom, grayer and calmer, with the gaze of someone who knows too well how easily the system can fail to see people. He didn't return to his hometown, for no one awaited him there. Instead, he settled in a small room on the outskirts of Charlotte, where evenings were spent listening to the radio and thinking about the fact that truth often comes not with a shout, but with silence. It was in such silence that the news broke. Federal investigators opened a case regarding major financial frauds, and among the names was Richard Bell. James immediately felt the familiar tension, as if a puzzle was beginning to assemble. He recalled the missing camera records, the rush at the trial, the tangled testimonies, and in his mind came the words of Ernest Hemingway. Trust is revealed where someone benefits from silence. Bell had won everything then: reputation, career, a clean name, and James had lost years of life. Now, truth was slowly surfacing, not as a sensation, but as a crack that could no longer be ignored. When one story begins to falter, others follow. James realized that the case everyone thought was closed was actually only beginning to reopen. The story began to breathe again, quietly at first, almost imperceptibly. In newspapers, it appeared as just another financial case, another name on a long list, but for James, every word carried weight. He began reading between the lines, listening more closely, recalling how library accounts had oddly balanced, how money had disappeared not once but systematically, and how a convenient culprit had been found too quickly. He wrote a letter to the federal investigator, not with demands, and from that moment, the story stopped being just one person's memory and began to return to the public sphere, where truth always hurts more but heals deeper. Doubt, once sown, never disappears. It slowly undermines even the strongest versions. The journalist delved deeper into the archives, old protocols, yellowed photos, trial transcripts. The more she read, the clearer it became that the town hadn't just made a mistake. It had deliberately chosen comfort over questions. The editor hesitated for a long time, because such texts do not bring reader love, but she recalled James Baldwin's words that not everything we face can be changed, but nothing can be changed until we face it. The article was published without a shout, without sensationalism, but that made it dangerous. People recognized their own voices from the past, their own silence and haste. Hundreds of miles away, Richard Bell felt the cold pressure of the past for the first time in years. The news hadn't yet named him guilty, but between the lines, it read too clearly. Lawyers advised silence, investors advised calm, and in that cautious quiet, he suddenly remembered the small town in North Carolina, the library with its old shelves, the night the money disappeared, and how easily it had all gone in his favor. He told himself it was coincidence, that the system had chosen James, but deep down, he knew, as Voltaire said, that coincidence is an excuse we invent for our own benefit. Meanwhile, federal investigators cross-referenced old bank transactions with new schemes tied to Bell. The lines connected too precisely to be a coincidence, and when they retrieved archive server recordings, which miraculously preserved the library's camera copies, the puzzle was almost complete. James was called to give testimony. He walked into the federal courthouse as a different man, not asking, but bringing truth. He spoke calmly, without accusation, and in that quiet certainty resonated Henry David Thoreau's thought. Truth is always stronger when it does not have to shout. While Bell still tried to maintain control over his public image, the mechanism set in motion many years ago began to turn against him. The hearing lasted hours, and James felt the years of silence finally bearing fruit. Witnesses who had once been afraid to speak now told details previously impossible. Bell's lawyers nervously checked folders for loopholes, but every fact, every testimony, formed a picture that could not be ignored. James looked at Bell and thought how easily everything had gone in the man's favor back then, how a convenient version of the case had silenced the truth, and how many had quietly agreed to it. The journalist, who had started the investigation, sat nearby, taking notes, her eyes shining with the realization that the words she had gathered for years were finally coming to life. She recalled Ralph Waldo Emerson's quote, "Every great truth begins in silence," reminding her that even after years of suppression, truth always finds its way. Bell nervously touched the documents, trying to retain control, but his efforts seemed futile. Each witness added another layer to the picture of what had happened, and James felt that the story no longer belonged to the town, nor to him. It belonged to the truth, which slowly, step by step, destroys myths built on fear and convenience. The courtroom was silent when one witness mentioned the names of those who had benefited from his downfall, and James realized that though he had lost years of his life, he was now part of what is called justice, because the story they had tried to close had decided to reveal itself. Truth began surfacing faster than anyone expected. Bell felt the ground beneath him unstable. The journalist published new material, each line containing facts impossible to ignore. Former witnesses gave interviews, naming those who had contributed to the injustice. Each name sounded like a small verdict. James observed all this with inexpressible calm, knowing this was not revenge but a logic that could not be stopped. Bell tried to justify himself, to convince people it was coincidence, that he had no knowledge of what happened, but words no longer worked. Even those who had once shouted guilty now felt their voices hollow. The town could no longer look away. The children James had once taught listened to the radio and read newspapers, seeing the adults' faces and understanding that past mistakes never go unpunished. Bell's lawyers whispered among themselves, trying to find a loophole, but there was none. Every document, every testimony formed a chain of facts that could not be broken. James felt his heart tighten and expand simultaneously, because truth destroys those who shouted lies and simultaneously liberates those who have long endured. He recalled Henry David Thoreau's words, "He who speaks the truth has a power no prohibitions can restrain." And in that power he saw not only his own restoration, but the true awakening of the entire town, which now had to face its own mistakes and understand that the injustice once called justice no longer exists, because truth allows no compromise. Bell felt the world he had built for years begin to crumble. Every article, every testimony, every archived number fit into a picture that could not be denied. He tried to brush it off, convince himself it was just noise, that old cases didn't matter, but James saw the fear slowly spreading across the former financier's face. Every new testimony highlighted his gain from what he had once hidden. Bell's attempts to fix the narrative failed. Every proof was a fragile stone in the wall of his reputation built on lies. James observed the courtroom silence grow heavier. Truth no longer needed to shout. It simply spoke. He recalled Martin Luther King. "Failure is not defeat until we stop trying," understanding that his patience and observation had finally led to the goal. Bell could no longer control the narrative. His attempts turned against him. The journalist noticed every twitch, every nervous gesture. And now she wrote not just an article, but a document of time showing how lies could hold a town in illusion, which now crumbled. Witnesses who once remained silent now spoke boldly, and James felt this was not just his story, but the story of everyone who once agreed to close their eyes to injustice. In that understanding, he felt true freedom, because truth, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, is always stronger when it is not hidden. And when Bell looked at the results of his past decisions, he finally saw that objective reality does not depend on his wishes, while James stood quietly, calmly, knowing justice had begun its course and would not stop. The story that had once been forced closed had finally come out, newspapers publishing facts that could not be denied. Bell felt his reputation crumble step by step. Friends and partners distanced themselves. Investors wondered what had really happened. His attempts to explain it as coincidence failed. James observed all this with a quiet that gave him strength. Every document, every witness, every testimony from archives was another proof of his wrongful conviction. The journalist wrote coldly and precisely, showing the chain of events that led to the verdict, which had closed the town for decades in convenient lies. And when Bell looked at the publications, at screens and newspapers, he saw that truth, though delayed, inevitably destroys those who build lives on deceit. Witnesses named the people who once pushed the system to a quick verdict, And in these words sounded a quiet but unbreakable judgment on a society that had been silent but was now forced to listen. James felt relief and the simultaneous weight of realizing that years had been lost, yet justice had finally begun. He recalled Eleanor Roosevelt's words, "Never allow anyone to make you feel unhappy without your consent," feeling that even after all suffering, he had retained his dignity. Truth was now on his side. It destroyed myths once taken for granted, and the town had to face reality. The injustice once called justice no longer existed. James remained a symbol that patience and persistence eventually lead to truth. Even those who had once shouted guilty now listened and understood that one cannot hide behind convenient explanations because truth always finds its way.